Every American president eventually learns that there are limits to executive power. Some learn it gracefully, others learn it the hard way. And then there's Donald Trump, who just discovered that the oil industry, the very industry he has spent years championing, deregulating, and defending against environmental oversight, has looked at his latest grand plan and said quite simply, no thank you. What happened with Venezuela this past week is one of the most revealing episodes of the entire Trump second term because it exposes something the administration desperately does not want you to see. Behind the strongman rhetoric, behind the threats and the tariffs and the executive orders, there exists a president who fundamentally does not understand how the global energy market actually works. And when your ignorance collides with the commercial interests of companies whose entire business model depends on understanding exactly how that market works, the result is precisely what we've just witnessed: a humiliating standoff in which some of the most powerful corporations in America have collectively decided that following this president's lead would be financial suicide. So what's really going on here? Why are major oil companies refusing to participate in what Trump has framed as a patriotic opportunity to secure American energy dominance? And what does their refusal tell us about the growing gap between this administration's rhetoric and the reality of American power on the world stage? By the end of this analysis, you'll understand not just why the oil companies said no, but why their refusal represents something far more significant than a single policy disagreement. It reveals the moment when corporate America began quietly but unmistakably distancing itself from the economic nationalism that Trump insists is making America great again. Let's start with what actually happened. In February 2026, the Trump administration unveiled what it characterized as a bold new approach to Venezuela, a country sitting atop some of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. The plan, in essence, involved tightening the sanctions regime that had been partially relaxed under Biden, while simultaneously inviting American oil companies to step in and develop Venezuelan crude under new licensing arrangements that would, in theory, bypass the Maduro government and channel revenues through mechanisms Washington could control. The logic, at least from the administration's perspective, seemed straightforward enough. Venezuela has oil. America wants cheaper oil. American companies should go get it. Problem solved. Except, of course, it was nothing close to solved. Because the moment administration officials began making calls to executives at Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and others, they encountered something they apparently hadn't anticipated: resistance. Not political resistance, not ideological resistance, commercial resistance grounded in the cold arithmetic of risk assessment and return on investment. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to appreciate the state of Venezuelan oil infrastructure. And this is where the gap between Trump's rhetoric and reality becomes genuinely striking. Venezuela's oil production has collapsed from roughly 3.5 million barrels per day at its peak to somewhere around 800,000 barrels per day currently. The national oil company, PDVSA, has been hollowed out by decades of mismanagement, corruption, and the very sanctions that various American administrations have imposed. Refineries are crumbling, pipelines are corroded, skilled workers have fled the country by the millions. Rebuilding this infrastructure would require investment measured not in hundreds of millions, but in tens of billions of dollars. And here's the critical thing to recognize: that investment would need to be made in a country where the legal framework for property rights is essentially whatever Nicolas Maduro decides it is on any given Tuesday morning. The oil companies know this. They know it because they've lived it. ConocoPhillips had assets worth billions seized by the Chavez government. ExxonMobil fought for years through international arbitration to recover a fraction of what was taken. These aren't theoretical risks. These are institutional memories that inform every single investment decision these companies make. Francisco Monaldi, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute, who specializes in Latin American energy policy, put it rather directly when he noted that no major international oil company will commit serious capital to Venezuela without ironclad legal guarantees that the current political environment simply cannot provide. The sanctions regime adds another layer of complexity, he argued, because companies face the prospect of investing billions, only to see the regulatory framework shift with the next election cycle. And this is precisely the point that the Trump administration either failed to grasp or chose to ignore. Oil companies don't operate on 4-year electoral cycles, they operate on 20 to 30-year investment horizons. When Chevron evaluates whether to pour $10 billion into Venezuelan heavy crude development, they're not asking whether Donald Trump will protect their investment next year. They're asking whether the American government, across multiple administrations, will maintain a consistent policy framework for the next 2 decades. And right now, given the whiplash between Obama's engagement, Trump's first-term maximum pressure, Biden's partial relaxation, and now Trump's second-term reinvention, the answer to that question is an emphatic no. Compare this to how these same companies approach investment decisions in other challenging environments. When ExxonMobil committed to major developments in Guyana, it did so within a legal framework that, while imperfect, offered meaningful protections and operated within a relatively stable political context. When Chevron expanded operations in Kazakhstan, it negotiated production sharing agreements with clearly defined terms spanning decades. These companies are not afraid of difficult operating environments. What they're afraid of is unpredictable ones. And right now, Venezuela, under American sanctions policy that changes with every new occupant of the White House, represents perhaps the most unpredictable operating environment on the planet. But it gets worse for the administration, because the refusal isn't happening in isolation. It's happening against the backdrop of a global energy market that has fundamentally shifted in ways that make Venezuelan heavy crude significantly less attractive than it was even a decade ago. The shale revolution has given American producers access to enormous domestic reserves that are cheaper to extract, easier to refine, and carry none of the political risk associated with operating in a hostile foreign jurisdiction. As you probably noticed, oil prices have been under sustained pressure as global demand growth slows and alternative energy sources continue their relentless expansion. In that environment, the commercial case for spending tens of billions to rehabilitate Venezuelan infrastructure that produces heavy, sour crude, a grade that requires specialized refining capacity, becomes extraordinarily difficult to justify to shareholders who have plenty of lower-risk opportunities available. The International Energy Agency's most recent assessment noted that global investment in upstream oil development is increasingly concentrated in jurisdictions offering political stability and regulatory predictability, with companies explicitly avoiding environments where government interference or sanctions volatility threatens returns. That description fits Venezuela so precisely, it might as well have been written with Caracas in mind. Now here's where the story takes on broader significance. The administration's response to corporate reluctance has been, shall we say, somewhat less than graceful. Rather than acknowledging the legitimate commercial concerns driving these decisions, officials have reportedly expressed frustration that companies aren't demonstrating sufficient patriotic enthusiasm for the president's vision. There have been suggestions, not yet formalized but clearly floated, that companies benefiting from domestic deregulation might be expected to show reciprocal willingness to support administration priorities abroad. Does anyone seriously believe that threatening oil executives is going to make them more willing to risk billions in a country where the last 3 major foreign investors all had their assets confiscated? The approach reveals something genuinely troubling about how this administration understands the relationship between government and business. Trump appears to believe that because he has been friendly to the oil industry on domestic regulation, the industry owes him compliance on international ventures that make no commercial sense. It's a transactional view of governance that treats major corporations as vassals rather than independent commercial entities with fiduciary obligations to their shareholders. And if you think this dynamic is limited to Venezuela, wait until you see how it plays out across other sectors where the administration expects corporate America to subordinate commercial judgment to political loyalty. The geopolitical implications extend well beyond the immediate question of Venezuelan oil. China and Russia have been steadily expanding their presence in Venezuela's energy sector, precisely because the American sanctions regime has created a vacuum that others are happy to fill. Russian state oil company Rosneft, despite facing its own sanctions complications, has maintained operational relationships with PDVSA. Chinese state-backed entities have continued purchasing Venezuelan crude and providing financing that keeps the Maduro government afloat. The irony is almost too perfect. Trump's stated objective of constraining Chinese and Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere is being actively undermined by the very sanctions policy he's intensifying. Every American company that declines to participate in Venezuelan development is an opportunity for Chinese and Russian state enterprises, which operate under entirely different risk calculations because they serve strategic rather than purely commercial objectives, to deepen their foothold. Jorge Piñón, director of the Latin America and Caribbean Energy Program at the University of Texas, has observed that American sanctions policy toward Venezuela has effectively handed China and Russia a strategic gift they couldn't have engineered themselves. By making it commercially impossible for Western companies to operate, Washington has ensured that the only entities willing to accept Venezuelan risk are precisely the geopolitical competitors America claims to be countering. This pattern, where Trump's policies produce exactly the opposite of their stated objectives, has become so consistent that it almost feels redundant to point it out. But redundant or not, the consequences are real and accumulating. Consider the broader energy security picture. The administration has simultaneously antagonized traditional energy partners in Canada through tariff threats, complicated relationships with Middle Eastern producers through unpredictable diplomatic signals, and now demonstrated its inability to mobilize domestic companies for its Venezuelan ambitions. At what point does someone in the administration step back and ask whether the pattern itself might be the problem? The European response is equally instructive. When EU officials were briefed on the administration's Venezuela plans, the reaction was reportedly one of barely concealed incredulity. European energy companies, already navigating their own complex sanctions landscape following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have zero appetite for additional exposure in jurisdictions where American policy could shift overnight. Shell, BP, and Total Energies have all made clear through back channels that Venezuelan involvement is not under consideration, regardless of what Washington proposes. This brings us to what is perhaps the most consequential dimension of this entire episode. The oil companies' refusal represents something larger than disagreement over a single country or a single policy. It represents a growing recognition within corporate America that this administration's approach to international economic policy is fundamentally unreliable. When companies cannot predict whether today's encouraged activity will become tomorrow's sanctioned activity, they default to the safest possible position, which means doing nothing. And doing nothing, in the context of Venezuelan oil development, means that a country with 300 billion barrels of proven reserves continues its slow collapse, its population continues to flee, and its strategic assets continue to drift toward Chinese and Russian control. The human cost, measured in Venezuelan lives destroyed by economic catastrophe, barely registers in an administration focused exclusively on the optics of appearing tough. Bringing all this together, the Venezuela oil episode reveals the central contradiction of Trump's energy policy with devastating clarity. He wants American energy dominance, but his approach to achieving it through unpredictable sanctions, transactional bullying, and fundamental misunderstanding of how capital allocation decisions actually work produces the opposite result. The companies that would need to execute his vision have examined the proposition and concluded that the risks are unacceptable, the returns are uncertain, and the political environment is too volatile to justify the investment. This isn't a story about oil companies being unpatriotic. It's a story about oil companies being rational. And when rational commercial actors uniformly reject a government's signature initiative, the problem lies not with the actors, but with the initiative. The consequences will unfold over years rather than months. Venezuela's oil infrastructure will continue to deteriorate. Chinese and Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere will continue to expand. American energy companies will continue to invest their capital in jurisdictions that offer what Venezuela under current conditions cannot: predictability, legal protection, and freedom from the whims of an administration that views commercial relationships as extensions of personal loyalty. When historians examine this period, they will find in the Venezuela oil episode a perfect microcosm of the broader failure. A president who believed that power meant simply commanding outcomes, confronted by a world in which power actually means creating conditions where desired outcomes emerge naturally. Trump tried to command. The oil companies, answerable to shareholders and bound by fiduciary duty, declined. And in that declination lies a truth this administration has never been willing to face: that you cannot bully your way to energy dominance any more than you can tariff your way to prosperity. Such is the way of things. When the strategic consequences of this failure become fully visible, when Chinese-controlled Venezuelan crude flows freely while American companies watch from the sidelines, the architects of this policy will express shock and outrage, but they will have no one to blame but themselves. The oil companies told them no. The question is whether anyone in this administration possesses the wisdom to ask why and the honesty to listen to the answer.